Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Marisol Laviña, and I am the Senior Program Manager for Public Affairs at the California Endowment. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all, our partners and our TCE staff, to today's webinar, Advancing Equity in California with New Infrastructure Investments. This is the fourth and final policy webinar the Public Affairs team will be hosting for the year. If you have attended the previous three, thank you so much for coming back. We are happy to have you. And if this is your first one, welcome. These learning sessions are intended to provide our partners and staff with timely information about policy developments and processes that impact our state and communities. As you may have heard, one of those recent developments was the enactment of the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which will invest over $1 trillion on infrastructure across the nation in the next 5 years. And this will go to support transportation, roads, water, and other infrastructure. And then at the state level, this year's historic budget surplus made way for numerous exciting initiatives to support economic development and recovery, climate resiliency, environmental justice, outdoor access, and so much more. And because of the historic levels of resources, this is a moment for all of us to step up to ensure the resources reach communities of color and communities most impacted by racial inequities and historical underinvestment. And it's important that we leverage this moment and the resources to advance equity and to support healthy communities. So today's focus will be twofold. One, to share information about the types of resources available to the state and communities, and what we know at this moment in time about how those resources will flow, because there are so many things that we still don't know as it's still early in the implementation. Secondly, we will also talk about what are some things that we can collectively do to advance equity through these new investments. Our presenters will provide information about select funding streams that we believe might be of interest to you, but know that we will not cover all of what's in the federal legislation or in the state budget. I also want to acknowledge that many of you may be tracking the Build Back Better bill. And while we will not talk about Build Back Better today, depending on what happens with it, it may be a topic for a future webinar. There will also be an opportunity at the end of the session today for you to tell us what topics you are interested in hearing about in the future. So please stick around for that. So without further ado, I will introduce our fantastic lineup of speakers. And I also want to take this opportunity to remind you all that if you have any questions along the way, we will have a chance for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please enter your questions in the chat. So to start and to give us an overview of some select funding streams in the Federal Infrastructure Bill, we have Michael Tora and Michael Uden from the Raven Group. Then they will turn it over to Veronica Villalobos Cruz from Cruz Strategies, who will talk about state-level initiatives and funding opportunities related to infrastructure, climate resiliency, and other investments. She will then be followed by Corey Brown from the Resources Legacy Fund, who will share some tangible steps that we can take to leverage these resources to advance equity and improve community health. And then to close out the presentations, we will have Xiaoni Munoz Legal from PolicyLink, who will dive deeper into opportunities to advance equitable implementation of infrastructure spending and also talk about an immediate opportunity for engagement. But before I turn it over to Michael, I just want to note that this is an informational, nonpartisan, non-lobbying, non-call to action learning session. And there will be a lot of information, but we will share all of the slide decks as they have very helpful links and resources for you to go back to. And also know that this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be shared with everyone. So thank you so much for being here. Please put your questions in the chat. And now over to you, Michael.
Great. Thank you so much, Marisol. It's really a pleasure to join you and everybody who's able to join us today online. So glad that you could join us. As Marisol mentioned, we've got a lot of really historic investments, public investments being made this year and beyond. So we had the American Rescue Plan Act at the beginning of the year. And now we've got, most recently at the federal level, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. As Marisol mentioned, Build Back Better isn't done yet, still being negotiated. The latest news we heard is that the Senate Majority Leader is going to aim to reach agreement on that by early January. So fingers crossed we'll be able to come together early in the new year to talk about what's in that bill when and if it's passed. But so keeping with today's theme, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, known in short just as the infrastructure bill. We can go to the next slide. This bill provides about a total of around $1.2 trillion over 5 years. And out of that, about half of it, $550 billion, is new spending. And this table provides just a sense of kind of how that breaks down by very broad category and some very early estimates that we got from the White House in terms of what California can expect to receive from some of those categories. So, next slide, please. About half of the funding of the new funding is going to go to transportation, and half is going to go to everything else. Actually, let's hop back to that previous slide. The transportation funding covers things like roads, bridges, city streets, rails, public transit, but also will cover things like pedestrian and cycling paths. All these things that we traditionally think about as transportation infrastructure. And then you're going to see there's everything else in this bill, and that includes, the everything else is like funding for clean drinking water infrastructure, broadband expansion, upgrading power grids, projects that improve resilience against climate change, and then environmental cleanup projects. This infrastructure bill is really an overdue opportunity to renew federal transportation funding and policy. For decades now, Congress has come together every 4, 5, or 6 years or so to update federal transportation policy and funding. But things kind of began to get difficult in the early 2000s because Congress just couldn't agree on how to pay for it, right? They couldn't. Normally, the big revenue stream for transportation projects was the federal gasoline tax, but they couldn't agree on raising the tax or any other kind of revenues. So what it meant is that for the last 20 years or so, transportation funding's been kind of anemic, right? So folks who really care about transportation are super excited about this bill because it gives a really big boost to transportation funding. And I think over the course of this presentation, hopefully you'll learn of some other reasons why actually we can all be excited about this bill, because it's so much more than just transportation. Although the transportation pieces in themselves are pretty exciting. I'll get to that in a moment. One thing to keep in mind is that this bill provides funding and authorizations for hundreds of programs. I'm not exaggerating. It's hundreds. So we're not going to get, there's no time to talk about all of them. So we're just going to highlight certain transportation programs, drinking water provisions, and some of the environmental remediation provisions that are in here, especially those where local communities are going to be able to get direct funding and where local communities can have a say in how funds are spent. So like Marisol said, you're going to get this deck after today's presentation, and there's some links in there so you can dive in like even deeper and get more details to see like what this federal bill does. All right, let's go to the next slide. So some key themes to think about for this entire bill. Number one, it boosts funding for both competitive grants as well as formula grants, right? Formula grants are like just those automatic disbursements that go out to states and localities. Competitive ones, the name speaks for itself. You got to compete for those, right? Submit applications, et cetera. Secondly, many of the programs, especially the new ones that are in this bill, prioritize disadvantaged communities. So there's a focus on equity that we haven't seen in past infrastructure bills. And when it comes to implementation, we know that this administration, they've already made really clear that they're going to really want to leverage the power of government to help advance equity. One of the things that the administration has done is established a goal, which is known as Justice 40, which is to deliver at least 40% of the benefits of federal climate and energy investments to disadvantaged communities. That's going to apply to a lot of the transportation and other programs that are in this law. But keep in mind, it's a goal, not a requirement, and it's at the discretion of this administration. But even with those caveats, I think this still presents some really potentially interesting opportunities, which we can get into more detail in the Q&A if folks are interested. The third kind of theme I want to lift up is just coordination and collaboration. This really applies to the transportation programs. You're going to see this drumbeat in the legislation, and you're going to be hearing it from the Secretary of Transportation and all the kind of sub-agencies under transportation, which is for coordination and collaboration. It's about breaking down silos, encouraging different stakeholders to work together, about making sure that big projects serve multiple purposes, right? And then a fourth note I want to just make, I know it's not on this slide, but it's just appropriations versus authorizations. I know this sounds really wonky, but typically Congress has a bill that either appropriates money, like gives money to particular projects, or that authorizes, right? That makes it possible for Congress to later give money to something. This bill does both. So it makes some actual appropriations, like it actually allocates money to, like, real money to programs. And then there's some programs that it just authorizes, that it allows Congress to fund in future years. So we'll make some of those distinctions as we go forward in this program. We're going to try to focus, though, on those where they've actually appropriated and they're giving money to right now. So, all right, let's dive in. Let's go to the next slide. Just transportation. This is kind of a quick overview of some of the new funding streams within transportation, broken down by different categories. Some of the initial estimates from the White House in terms of what California's share will be. Again, you can stare at this later on when you get the slide deck, but let's go to the next one, because I want to, the next slide, perfect. Look at, these are some of the major, like, formula funding streams, right? So these are the funding streams under what's called, like, the major highway programs. And I do air quotes for highway because in the transportation bill and Department of Transportation, when they talk about highways, they're not talking about the way you and I talk about it. It's about, highways is more than just interstates, right? We're not talking about the 5 and the 101. We're talking about that, but we're also talking about roads, city streets, bike paths, walking trails, etc. Okay. So these are all funding streams where money is going to be going out to states and localities. So it's really exciting. You'll see, kind of on the far right column, for several of them, we're talking about billions of dollars over the next 5 years. So let's go to the next slide. I just want to hone in on one of these, which is the Surface Transportation Block Program. And the reason why I wanted to highlight that one is because not only is this one of the biggest funding streams of the formula funding streams, but it's because this provides really flexible funding to states and localities for projects related to roads, bridges, pedestrian and cycling paths, transit capital projects, electrical vehicles, charging infrastructure, and a lot more. So there's a lot of flexibility here. Local governments love this because, well, in addition to all this flexibility to be able to spend it on whatever the local transportation needs are, they also get about half the money. The federal government passes the money through the state and on to what are called metropolitan planning organizations, which are basically groupings of local government. So as you can see, this infrastructure bill is going to give California a really nice bump. You see kind of like that light blue column is what California is getting, this year, the year that's almost over, under the previous transportation law. We're going to get, it's like in 1 year, this big 15% bump, which is pretty unprecedented. And then we're going to see some gradual increases over the next 4 years. So we're going to go from like just over $1 billion to almost $1.2 billion within just 1 year for this. All right, so next slide. Because I know there's interest in the pedestrian and biking infrastructure. I just want to talk about that a little bit more. The important thing to know is that great block grant funding stream I just mentioned isn't the only formula funding stream. There's also others. Remember that theme about breaking down silos? So, a lot of the goals of other programs, whether it's to relieve congestion or combat carbon emissions or promoting safety, those all overlap with the need for better pedestrian and cycling infrastructure. So there's going to be the ability to use dollars from all these other programs you see listed here for biking and cycling infrastructure. Next slide. I mentioned before, we also have a lot of funding increases for competitive grants. And so here are some of the big competitive grant programs where, localities and, kind of diverse groups of stakeholders can apply directly to the Department of Transportation to get funding, right? And so there's, under active transportation, there's actually a state program you may have heard of, the Active Transportation Program, which actually combines some state money and federal funding to create sort of statewide and local competitive grant programs. And there's also going to be a federal active transportation grant program, so you can apply directly to the U.S. Department of Transportation. And then there's going to be others as well. So let's go to the next category that I want to highlight, and that is low and no emissions vehicles, right? So there's various programs that are in this bill to promote the use of electric and alternative fuel vehicles. So 4 of them that I want to highlight here, 4 of the big ones. There are 2 programs under electrical vehicle charging stations. We've never done this before in a transportation bill. So these are new programs. We've got one that's a formula funding program that goes out to the states, and another one that's a competitive grant program really focused on communities. And it's $7.5 billion. And the goal is to really help the administration reach its goal of creating a nationwide network of about 500,000 electric vehicle chargers by the end of this decade. There's also a program to replace diesel school buses with low or no emission buses. And then lastly, there's the existing what's called the Low-No program, which is to help transit agencies get cleaner buses. That program has now basically been put on steroids. So what used to be a pretty small, almost unnoticeable program is now getting about 25 times as much funding as it had before. So this is suddenly now a big program to replace dirty buses in our transit systems. So perfect segue to talk some more about public transit. So next slide. Because we can't, when we think about equity in transportation, you got to talk about public transit, right? And the good news is that the infrastructure bill includes an historic boost of funding for public transit, right? Whether that's buses or light rail or anything else that's public transit. It's a 43% increase in funding. Again, a lot of that is going through formula grants. There's also competitive grant funding. One of the larger formula funding streams that helps local communities is called the Urbanized Area Formula Grant. So there's a little more information about that here on this slide. And that's a great flexible funding stream that can be used for big capital projects, for operating expenses, as well as for planning. Some of that money is going to go directly to kind of large urban areas, those that have more than a population of over 200,000 people, and then the rest will kind of go through states to then get to communities. So the last program I want to talk about under transportation is this new program called the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. You may not have heard about this one before. Like I say, it's new, but as you're probably aware, in the past, a lot of big infrastructure projects and smaller ones too completely disregarded communities of color. They bulldozed through communities, cut them off from centers of economic opportunity, while at the same time we're connecting predominantly white suburbs with job centers and other areas of economic opportunity. So this program is meant to repair those wrongs, right? It provides $500 million and then also authorizes Congress to provide another $500 million over the next 5 years. It's going to be a competitive grant program. And it hits those themes I talked about in the beginning: coordination, collaboration, and equity. The bill also provides formal backing to the creation of what they're calling community advisory boards, really to facilitate community engagement on the project, as well as to hold grant recipients accountable by tracking their progress on things from like inclusive employment to contracting and economic development. So it'll be a really interesting program, see how this unfolds. The Department of Transportation has said that they're hoping to be able to provide these grants to about 20 different communities around the country. Again, it's a pilot program, so we're not going to see funding for this everywhere, but hopefully we'll be able to get one or two of them in California. So that wraps up my transportation highlights. Now I want to turn over to my colleague, Michael Uden, and he's going to share some of the highlights about the bill's provisions on drinking water and environmental remediation.
Thanks, Michael. Just real quick, there's so much to cover, but I want to give you some high-level highlights for this investment. So the infrastructure law provides about $55 billion in new spending for water infrastructure. The bulk of money will go to the state revolving loan funds, $43.4 billion to those state revolving funds to provide below market rate loans and grants to fund water infrastructure improvements to protect public health and the environment. It's worth noting that 49% of the funding will be administered as grants and completely forgivable loans. So the funding for the SRF, the state revolving funds, as you may know, there are two revolving funds. There's the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and then there's the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. This $43 billion takes about $23 billion for and splits it between the two. So there's $23.4 billion split between the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So it's 5 years worth of funding. The EPA has already announced that it will allocate the first year of funding, which is $7.4 billion to the states. And again, like I said, this is a 5-year funding, so this is the first year just for 2022. In dedicated funding, California is estimated to receive $609 million, a little over $609 million. It's worth noting that it's a top priority for the EPA. They've said it, they've articulated it, to ensure that communities that have historically struggled to access these funds are prioritized. The EPA strongly will urge states to maximize the potential to remove barriers and prioritize the distribution of grant funds to disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. So this is around PFAS, right? We're talking about PFAS now, PFAS contamination. The total of $10 billion to address PFAS, $5 billion will be distributed through the state revolving funds to address PFAS or any pollutant identified by the administrator as a contaminant of emerging concern. Up to 100% of the funding will be administered as grants, and the EPA will prioritize investment to local communities who are on the front lines of PFAS contamination and who have few options to finance solutions through traditional programs. The other $5 billion will go through the small and disadvantaged community grant programs. Those grants will be awarded as non-competitive grants to states to support disadvantaged communities or communities with a population of under 10,000 that lack household drinking water or wastewater services, or that are served by a public water system that violates or exceeds a requirement of the National Primary Drinking Water Regs. So grants can be used to assist communities coming into compliance with drinking water regs, to provide programs for household water quality testing, provide assistance that directly and primarily benefits the disadvantaged community on a per household basis. You can use those funds to purchase filters, filtration systems, and other types of uses. It's worth noting that the law changes the required non-federal cost match. Under current, or previously it was 45%, it's now down to 10%. And the EPA can actually waive that 10% if the administrator determines that an eligible entity is unable to pay or would experience significant financial hardship. Other slide, real quick, I'm going to be brief. We have a lot to cover, so bear with me. I'm really going to be quick, right? So there is additional $15 billion for lead service line replacement. There is $3.5 billion for the Indian Health Service sanitation facilities and construction program. And so these are direct dollars, but then Congress also authorized the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act, and it authorizes a number of programs and grant opportunities for drinking water, but it does not provide direct funding for these programs. So It made some changes to this drinking water state revolving fund, increasing the minimum percentage of additional subsidies that must go to disadvantaged communities from 6% to 12%. And there are other requirements. I, again, just want to be brief. There are other grants totaling about $2.75 billion that'll go out to nonprofits and other entities to help connect households to existing drinking water or wastewater infrastructure, or install or upgrade decentralized wastewater systems. There's, lead removal for schools, rural and low-income systems, and the like. And the EPA has said in the coming weeks and months it will provide additional information on the impact of the law and how resources will be directed. So quickly on the environmental remediation, we have two key programs, the Superfund and the Brownfield. The infrastructure will invest $5.4 billion in cleaning up legacy pollution at Superfund and Brownfield sites. It's worth noting that more than 1 in 4 Black and Hispanic Americans live within 3 miles of a Superfund site. The Congress provided $3.5 billion to clean up and continue moving forward on remedial actions for Superfund sites. It is important to note that there is one Superfund site that's been listed in California. That's the Stoker Company in Imperial County. And then finally, Brownfields. There's about $1.5 billion equally distributed over 5 years for state and tribal assistance grants to help communities and states and others to assess, safely clean up, and sustainably reuse contaminated properties. It provides about $1.2 billion for competitive grants, and the remaining $300 million has been dedicated for Brownfield's categorical grants, and there are a number of different grant programs. Eligible entities for the various Brownfield grant programs include state and local governments, regional quasi-governmental agencies, and nonprofits. So I know I talked really, really quickly. I apologize, and I'm going to turn it back over to Michael.
Great, thank you, Michael. So on the next slide, you might be wondering, like, okay, so when are all these federal dollars going to flow? This is a very kind of approximate timeline. The key thing to know is getting funds out for existing programs is going to move more quickly than sort of new programs, just because it takes less work. Again, remember, there's hundreds of programs on this bill. So spare a thought for the civil servants who are now needing to get all this money out, right? Because Congress has passed the bill, and now the ball is in the court of the federal agencies to come up with the guidelines and the guidance, et cetera, that needs to accompany these funds as they distribute them. So we'll first see, starting in a few weeks, funding for existing formula grant programs going out, and then we'll begin to see some of those competitive grant announcement opportunities announced, and then after that we'll see the new programs in the spring. Probably starting with the formula programs, and then the competitive grant ones being announced after that. So just know that this administration is going to be really eager to show progress in 2022 in terms of implementing this bill. So just expect a big whirlwind of activity. It's going to be pretty exciting. As I said before, this is really, these are historic investments, right? And it's an historic opportunity to really leverage these investments towards equity. So, looking further ahead, it's going to be really important to speak about the successes of these investments so that there's public awareness about them, and so that the public values them and demands more public investments in the future, because we don't want this to be the last time. Great. So with that, now let's talk about more exciting investments at the state level. I'm pleased to turn it over to Veronica to take it away.
Thank you, Michael. So while the slide deck goes up, I just wanted to welcome everybody, and also forewarn you that my slides are very dense, and that was for a very specific purpose, and that is to provide you all with a resource that you can use after this presentation. And I know the endowment will be sending out the slide decks as a resource for you all. So there may be more information than a typical presentation, but hopefully it's helpful. as we move forward in terms of programs being implemented at the state level. So my slide deck looks at one, budget opportunities for communities, nonprofits, and community members, and two, a very quick budget preview for 2022 at the end of the slide. So next slide. So as you all may know, the past year was very unprecedented, and the state budget that California was working with included a $75 billion surplus. So from the time when the legislative session began in January of 2021, members were assuming we were going to be dealing with the deficit due to the pandemic. And then when the May revision of the budget came about, they were dealing with this ginormous surplus and had to allocate the monies very quickly. So you will note as we go through the slide deck that there are a number of new programs that the state is trying to jumpstart, and then a number of programs that were augmented greatly, but we'll go into more detail. There were a number of trailer bills that were passed at the very end of session, and so the budget had to be signed at the end of June. They had a few more months to work on some broad funding bills, and so those late trailer bills were dealing with the Community Economic Resilience Fund, with broadband, wildfire, and climate, and those were probably the most significant spending bills that we had seen, or trailer bills that we saw this session. There were two issues that did not get fully addressed. One was the transportation package, and another is the energy package. There were disagreements, particularly about high-speed rail within the transportation package, so that did not move forward. And there is an assumption that the members will be dealing with that in January. And so those will be mid-year actions taken in January of 2022 for those two issues. And then lastly, we have already heard from the Legislative Analyst's Office that California can expect an additional significant surplus, and we're looking at this point, $31 billion in non-Prop 98 monies for the next fiscal year. And we can talk a little bit about that at the end. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, these are very dense slides, and hopefully they're a resource for you all to take, but I will just go through and highlight some of the significant program augmentations that were made, and some of the new programs that were developed that you all may be interested in. As my colleagues mentioned in the previous presentation, there is an equity focus on many of these programs, and so I tried to pick and choose those sorts of programs, and all these programs have an expanded eligibility where nonprofits are eligible to apply. So I also included resources, so you'll see additional links to the agency website or the email list sign up to get additional information. So I'll start with the climate resiliency investments, and the climate resiliency trailer bill equal to about $3.7 billion. And so these investments range from climate to wildfire to water. And so there's a lot of work across departments. About $370 million of this will be allocated in 21-22, so the current fiscal year. And then $2.1 billion will be in 22-23, and $1.2 billion is in 23-24. And so as we go forward, you'll note there are intended allocations over a 3-year period, which is rare in the state budget. But because there's so much money, the agencies just can't get it out that quickly, and so they spread out the money over 3 years. And I made note of some of those allocations as we go forward. So a few within climate resiliency is the transformative climate communities. that is a current program, but they ran out of funding, and so there's a new round of funding at the Strategic Growth Council. These funds will help the communities create community-led development and infrastructure projects. The target here is to decrease greenhouse emissions. And so I know folks were very excited about the allocation for the TCC program. They're currently the guidelines are currently being created, and so I believe they should be adopted towards the end of January. A public comment period has already occurred, but you'll find more information on the SGC website. There's a few other programs, the community resilience centers to help fund facilities during extreme heat and climate change disasters. The regional climate collaboratives is also in the SGC office, and the regional climate adoption planning and implementation grants. And so there are significant monies here for programs that try to integrate the community in decision-making processes when it comes to climate-related efforts. Next slide. Again, continuing on in the climate world, there are two urban greening and forestry programs, $50 million for a competitive grant program. Both have a disadvantaged community aspect to the programs. And so there are resources here that you can find more information. The urban greening and forestry program has 3 years of funding, so $50 million this year, and then $200 million the next 2 fiscal years. And those projects can include parks, open space, more walkable and bikeable trails, and projects improving water and air quality. Another program you may have heard about is the Outdoors for All in the Parks Department, and that's also under the Natural Resources Agency. $155 million for the statewide parks program, which is a competitive program to improve local parks in the most disadvantaged communities in our state. And then $40 million for the Outdoor Equity Grant Program, really to increase access for underserved youth to the outdoors. Next slide. And in the California Environmental Protection Agency, there is a grant program, the Environmental Justice Initiative, $10 million for the current fiscal year, and then $15 million for the next 2 fiscal years, created to address environmental justice issues in areas that have been disproportionately affected by pollution. And here I laid out a few of the projects that are eligible for monies, including really increased outreach, communication, and increased information in these various communities. And again, how to promote the community to be involved in various decision-making processes. Next slide. I won't spend too much time, but this is the Community Economic Development Fund Program. It's being administered by a few different agencies. This is one that's in process, and I know we will have Policy Link speak in more detail to this, but I just wanted to lay out how significant this is, and really an opportunity for community members to get involved in regional decision-making processes for strategic investments in your area. And there's $600 million of funding available for this program, $65 million for the planning processes in regions, and $500 million of implementation dollars. And so there's a webinar in the coming weeks through the Office of Planning and Research. Next slide. So with regard to housing, there was about $21 billion invested in housing and homelessness. About half of that was in the development of affordable housing. So these are just two allocations I wanted to highlight. One is the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, about $200 million for the next fiscal year and the following. And then a $100 million program through Cal HFA, which is a first-time homeowner assistance program, which there are many dollars that are going to go towards the infill development, the development of affordable housing, but these are two that I just wanted to highlight. Next slide. And within transportation and energy, as I noted earlier, the bulk of the transportation investments are being held until January 2022 for further deliberation, but there were a few items in the budget that were funded, and so a few that I wanted to lay out here include, clean transportation equity investments, 150 million there, and really a use for incentive outreach, technical assistance, capacity building, additional clean vehicle rebate monies, EV charging station, and then a new $10 million for electric bicycle incentives project. Next slide. And again, many more programs under the water and environment, but I wanted to highlight these broad, I guess, investments under water. There was $5.2 billion over 3 years for drought response and water resilience. $1 billion in ARPA funds were committed to assisting individuals for unpaid water bills. 1.3 billion for drinking water and wastewater infrastructure, and then 71 million in a new competitive grant program for the cleaning up of brownfield sites, supporting those impacted communities. And that is through the Department of Toxic Substance and Control. Next slide. So another, I think, big success within the state this past year was a significant investment in broadband infrastructure. Due to the ARPA funds, the federal funds that came through, the state adopted $6 billion and committed that towards broadband infrastructure over the coming years. And one major project will be a $3.75 billion middle mile open access network that will be built down the state. Additional monies at the PUC for local governments to leverage when they want for infrastructure. And then $2 billion for what they call last mile projects. So connecting the middle mile to households and schools and other entities. And this is monies that will go through the Public Utilities Commission through the CASIF program. This year they opened up the CASIF program to counties and other entities, in addition to the regional consortia that are in existence. So a real big, I think, success here in the area of broadband for the state. Next slide. And just quickly, a preview of what we may see this coming year. As mentioned, there's a significant surplus that the Legislative Analyst Office is already estimating. This surplus, this does not include the monies that Michael shared in the previous presentation. And so that some of that money will be allocated through the legislative process, and we'll see those reflected in the proposed budget that the governor puts out in January. Both the Senate and the Assembly put out kind of broad priorities for 2022 because of what they call the GAN limit and how much resources we have. It's very difficult to explain what the GAN limit is, but there will be a trigger. Well, the state will have to spend some of that surplus on infrastructure or even provide rebates to taxpayers. And so the Assembly has mentioned they are interested in committing $10 billion for school facilities and $10 billion for transportation projects. And the Senate has expressed interest in looking at transportation, education, broadband, and additional monies for climate and disaster resiliency. Both plans stress the need to promote equity and also look at those investments made this past year and ensure that there's some accountability that things get done. There's a lot of money that went out, and so there will be a lot of time spent on agency accountability. Next slide. And this is just a really broad timeline for the next 6 months. If folks were unfamiliar with the process, the legislature reconvenes in early January. The governor will release his proposed budget the second week of January, and then new bills will be introduced in February. And they will work on budget estimates and budget hearings until May, when the May revise of the budget comes out. Next slide. This is the last slide. Additional resources. There's one I just want to highlight is this database of state grants. It was launched in 2022, passed through legislation, or created through legislation, and administered by the California State Library. So it's www.grants.ca.gov. It's really handy, and you can sign up and actually target which sort of opportunities you want updates on, and they will send you updates of when the application period opens, comment period, more information about the application, and so it's pretty thorough. So I just wanted to flag that website for folks. And I think that's it. So I'm going to hand it over to Corey Brown, who will talk more in detail about how folks can get involved.
Great. Thank you, Veronica. And thank you, Veronica and the Michaels, for an excellent discussion of the abundance of state and federal funding that's going to be available for projects that can help advance equity and improve community health. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this part of the presentation will focus on some tools to help you find and secure funding for your community's improvement projects, as well as how to find technical assistance and some grant writing assistance, as well as to how to impact some of the key funding sources to make sure that those funds go to the right projects in the right communities. Let's go to the next slide, please. So finding funding for your projects is absolutely critical, because the funds don't necessarily end up in the right communities, the communities with the greatest need to advance equity, unless there are good projects that are developed to compete for these funds. We are, as the previous speakers mentioned, in a time where there's going to be historic funding available that can be tremendously beneficial to communities. And hopefully this session will help you understand where that funding is and how to secure it. Let's go to the next slide, please. One of the tools that was developed with funding from the California Endowment and the California Community Foundation is called the Funding Navigation for California Communities program, that can be found at www.fundingresource.org. The program provides information about 8 categories of projects and could be expanded to include others, and that provides funding about current grant opportunities by clicking on active transportation, public transit, road repair, affordable housing, parks, safe drinking water, or wastewater disposal. You can find out a series of grant opportunities that are available now for funding for each of those categories. That information is helpful in terms of tailoring that to your needs, and it provides information for over 100 different funding sources that include state funding, federal funding, and in some regions, regional funding as well. The program also provides the opportunity to get tailored assistance in identifying the most likely funding sources for your specific projects. There's a simple form that you can access that you send to local government commission on the website. They'll do the research and provide you advice as to which of the funding sources are most likely to be viable for your project, and strategic advice on how to secure that funding. They also have a monthly newsletter update that you can sign up for on the website that provides the latest information about funding availability. And there's also the ability to contact the local government commission directly for additional information. Next slide, please. For each of the over 100 funding sources, there's very critical information that's to help you understand the funding source and the funding eligibility. Who's eligible to apply for the funds? What the particular funding source funds? When grant applications are due? How much fund is available? How difficult it is and how competitive that grant funding source is, as well as links to more information. The front page of the website also includes a 6-minute introductory video explaining how the program works and how you can access this critical information. Let's go to the next slide, please. Many of you will find with your projects the need for technical assistance and grant writing help, and there's some assistance available. More is being developed over time. Technical assistance is built into several of the state funding programs. Probably the most helpful program are the Safe Drinking Water and Clean Water Act programs at the State Water Resources Control Board. And that ties into some of the funding sources, both the state and federal funding sources that were discussed in the previous discussion. Over $1 billion of funding at the state level and more coming in from the Federal Infrastructure Act. The State Water Resources Control Board's Office of Sustainable Water Solutions has a technical assistance program that can help ready projects, help provide lots of technical advice, and in some cases, they can also help provide grant writing assistance. There are also nonprofit organizations in key communities that can also help with accessing these funds and getting projects ready, including Community Water Center, Self-Help Enterprise, Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, Rural Community Assistance Corporation, and others. There are also transportation programs like the Active Transportation Program that Caltrans runs, where local government commission can provide technical assistance and some grant writing assistance. Also, in some of the ballot measures like Proposition 68, that provides $4 billion for various park and grant programs. Each program is allowed to spend up to 10% of their funds for technical assistance to low-income communities. There's also in affordable housing grants and tax credits, several nonprofit and for-profit affordable housing developers that are experts in understanding how to piece together the abundant state funding for affordable housing, tax credit programs, and others to make these type of programs happen. In creating parks, organizations like Trust for Public Land, the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, and others can also help bring about local park projects as well. So a lot of resources available. The foundation community is looking how to provide additional technical assistance, and hopefully we'll be seeing more funds in this area, both through legislation as well as philanthropic funding over the next couple of years. Let's please go to the next slide. So there's some key funding opportunities I want to highlight. Some of those were covered in the previous discussions. One of the most important funding sources is the Transformative Climate Communities Program. The legislature over the next 3 years will allocate $420 million for this program. The reason I want to highlight this program is it provides the most comprehensive way of helping improve equity and community health by allowing communities to develop what group of projects they want to have funded, as long as those projects have a greenhouse gas reduction element to them. They can provide a variety of different types of projects. According to the Strategic Growth Council that administers the program empowers communities most impacted by pollution to choose their own goals, strategies, and projects to reduce GHG emissions and local air pollution. This is another program that's funded by cap and trade funds. Transform Fresno is a great example of this type of program. The legislature allocated a good amount of money for Transform Fresno, which was originally thought of as a program where most of the funding would go to downtown Fresno revitalization. But the communities began to realize the funding opportunity to improve West Fresno with leadership from Fresno BHC, Building Healthy Communities, with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, and great community activists. They were able to get the program design based upon community input. 160 community member advisory committee helped develop projects. 126 community members came to the critical meeting to vote on the projects, and a majority of the funding is now going to improvements in West Fresno, one of the lowest income communities in California, one of the most pollution burdened communities. And that the TCC grant with $66.5 million, it helped leverage $85.5 million from other funding sources for a total of about $152 million, over half of which is going to benefit West Fresno. And it funds a variety of interesting projects. A community college satellite campus located in West Fresno, 56 affordable homes, solar panels for 200 homes, 17 acres of parks and community gardens, more frequent bus frequency from electric buses, and other projects that were voted on by the community. Very exciting to be able to get that level of funding on that well thought out type of project. And it all happened because community organizers, the community stepped up, had a vision, and asked for specific types of benefits for their program, and they were able to secure funding. Money has gone to Ontario that just received a $33 million grant. Stockton received an $11 million grant. Funding went to Watts and many others. It's a concept of a program that began with the nonprofit community with a lot of leadership from Greenlining Institute and many others. Let's go to the next slide, please. There are also key opportunities to impact how projects get funded from various grant programs. As one of the speakers previously mentioned, there are program guidelines that are developed for most of the competitive grant programs that have a public process. The public process is a very important place for equity advocates to help shape what type of projects those funding streams will actually fund, to make sure that the projects go to the communities with the greatest needs, the communities that have a pollution burden, as well as communities that can improve community health. This program guidelines provide a great opportunity to impact how these billions of dollars of funds will be allocated. One program I want to call out is the California Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure that was adopted last summer by the Newsom administration. The program focuses on advancing two critical goals with transportation funding: equity and climate with reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The program will include establishing a environmental justice advisory committee and an equity index to track how funding goes, both of which provide great opportunities for input for the environmental justice community. And the goal of the program, or one of the key goals, is to impact $5.5 billion of annual state transportation funding to advance equity and climate goals. Great opportunity. There are going to be some challenges getting some of the agencies that are really always focused on road development and freeway expansion to shift those funds to community projects that advance pedestrian safety, bicycle safety, and transit and other programs that help communities rather than increase the pollution burden. The picture on the right is from a program that was adopted in the city of Richmond with leadership from a nonprofit group called Pogo Park, where they built partnerships with technical consultants with the city of Richmond, local government commission, conservation fund, and others. They received a $240,000 planning grant from Caltrans, and they leveraged over $10 million for a variety of improvements in Richmond, including safer pedestrian and bicycle transportation, parks, green belts, and many others. Another great example of how projects can move forward with community input. The Natural Resources Agency just announced the Outdoors for All program that will help direct about $1 billion of funding to help increase access to state parks and help build more local parks with the target of helping disadvantaged communities and park poor communities. There's also various state and regional allocations for the federal funds. The CAPT program, the California Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, can help guide how state funding is allocated for the share of transportation funds the state receives. Many of the regional transportation agencies will also receive significant funding that you have opportunities to impact how those funds are allocated. And of course, the state budgets are very key in terms of actually appropriating the funding and including direction to the state agencies as to how to allocate those funds, including requirements that funds benefit disadvantaged communities. Like Proposition 68, the 2018 Park Bond Act, legislation can also include minimum requirements as to what how much funding at least has to be allocated to the communities most in need. Let's go to the final slide, please. So now it's time to begin the quest for funding. Many of you have a tremendous experience with it. Some of you can benefit from many of the resources we discussed. It's so important to be able to understand and articulate the problems you seek to solve, finding viable solutions, knowing what you want, seeking help from partners where needed, and then getting your projects ready to compete. Very hopeful that these resources that we've discussed, both in terms of what funding is available and some of the tools that can be helpful for you, will help you advance equity and community health in your communities as well as statewide. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn it over to Shioni Flegel with PolicyLink to discuss some other exciting opportunities.
Thank you, Corey. It is hard to come at the end of receiving so much information, so I hope folks can bear with us just a little bit longer. I'll try and keep my comments brief. I wanted to take us up for just a minute. So I'll be sharing a little bit about how we think about equitable infrastructure at PolicyLink. This is a big focus of our work, and we really do believe is a critical path to achieving our vision for equity for low-income people, for people of color, for communities that have been disinvested in. Again, my name is Shioni Flegel. I'm a managing director at PolicyLink. I'm joining you today from unceded Ohlone territory, also known as Oakland, California, and it's a great pleasure. If we could go to the next slide. When we think about equity and infrastructure, and I'm sorry the font on this may be smaller than I intended, we really are talking about embedding a set of principles in the way that we make investments and in the investments themselves. The principles that we think about at PolicyLink are really serving underinvested communities without pushing out existing residents. So really thinking about the investment without displacement lens, improving the environmental health and quality of life for residents in disinvested places. I know many of the folks on this room have spent much time and focused much of your work on actually accomplishing this. So this is an exciting moment to think about how we take these resources and apply them to that work. We also think about infrastructure being equitably owned, financed, and funded. So we want to see our small business community, contractors, people who are providing financial services to our communities in a variety of ways to be able to participate in the ownership and construction of new infrastructure. We want good jobs for our community members and business opportunities for local residents. We think it is, not yet critical that we be investing along with our infrastructure, that we actually be investing in developing a workforce that can participate in the construction, operations, and maintenance of that infrastructure. Too many of our communities are struggling with significant barriers to employment and haven't been afforded the human investments that they need to really be able to participate in this infrastructure. So we think that that's an important part of how we think about actually implementing the infrastructure, is not just building the projects, but investing in the people who can participate in building, again, those projects. And then finally, community inclusion is absolutely critical to the point, some of the points that Corey ended with. We know that our community residents actually know what's best for them. They have the solutions to their community's problems, and they need to be involved in the process. And I'll say, trained as both with a background in environmental science and then a master's degree in urban planning, this is not something that we're taught in school. So many of the folks who are trying to help support implementation of this work actually haven't been trained in what a good community participation process looks like and how to engage folks. And that's where it really does become incumbent on the advocacy community and equity leaders in places to help bring those issues up, set the table, change the terms of the conversation, and really create space for community voices to be embedded in decision-making processes. Next slide, please. When we think about what's important, we actually think about the work that the California Endowment has supported through so many of you, that this is a phenomenal room, virtual room full of expertise, critical to center the lived experiences of most of the people most impacted. I don't know everyone who is on this call today, but I know that this is a work that folks working in the communities across California, through the Building Healthy Communities collaboratives, through the statewide advocacy, have really brought to this work every day. As Corey mentioned, really thinking about what are the assets that you already have. Are there projects that you've already developed, plans you've been thinking about, priorities that your community's already articulated, infrastructure and your relationships and networks that has been built that you can leverage for this. Bringing all of those things to bear is going to be critical for actually pulling down all the resources that we've talked about today and bringing them into the community. I'll talk more about this in the next set of slides, but it's really hard to move this work forward alone. So thinking about how you build multi-sectoral strategic partnerships that include community knowledge, that include technical knowledge, that may bring in unlikely stakeholders in health and education and workforce development or the like, that those partnerships really can help accelerate this work, both by drawing on expertise and by setting a shared community vision for what success can look like. We've found that organizing people around shared values and narratives is critical. And some of the work that we've been doing, thinking about how we talk about things and what that does to create space for change and for winning these investments, is that it's really important that we learn how to talk about race in a way that brings people together, that allows everybody to see folks, see themselves, see others as being both part of the imagining of the next solution and part of the implementation and benefiting from those solutions. So this is a critical piece that I think, again, you as leaders really bring expertise to and can help bring to life in these conversations about infrastructure. And then finally, I would just encourage that this is a marathon. This is super hard work, and it doesn't happen slowly, which can make it incredibly difficult to bring people together around, because folks stick into it for 10 years from the time you think of a project to the time it's built and actually up and running. It is hard to hold folks' attention for that time, to sustain the financial resources you need to be engaged and the like. But that really is what takes success. I learned this personally working on a schoolyard improvement project. My son was in kindergarten when we started that project. He's in the 8th grade, and it got finished about a year ago. So figuring out how you can hold your community of advocates together for that long work is critical. I'm going to talk now about a particular set of investments that the state of California is going to be making that is providing a new opportunity for folks to engage. So if we can go to the next slide. Veronica talked a little bit about the Community Economic Resilience Fund, and her presentation was established in the budget trailer bills this past summer. And it put $600 million into a fund administered by the SURF leadership team, which includes the California Labor and Workforce Development Board, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and the Office of Business and Economic Development, or GoBiz. This fund was really created to support the vision of promoting a sustainable and equitable recovery from COVID-19 that creates high quality and accessible jobs for all Californians. In particular, the program is designed to support the development of regional economic roadmaps that invest in industries that will thrive in a carbon neutral future and build sustainable economic growth. So the program is really thinking about how do we support a just transition, and also recognize that across the state, communities are experiencing all kinds of economic transitions as industries change, as new industries grow, and that we need to support folks in planning for that change in a way that actually lifts up disadvantaged workers, people who are impacted by climate change, folks who are impacted by these big shifts in our economy. The program seeks to align and leverage state, federal, philanthropic, and private sector investments to maximize recovery efforts and catalyze long-term economic resilience. And it really calls out at the front end that this program should integrate the priorities of community residents and should bring them in to regional planning processes in very robust ways. Next slide, please. So what it funds, more specifically, the state has kind of divided up our places into a proposed 13 regions that will be collaborating with each other to develop what they're calling high road transition collaboratives. And these collaboratives, as I said earlier, are really charged with undertaking a planning process that would lay out a roadmap for supporting a transition to a more economically or more resilient economic future in regions. The planning grant solicitation is expected, it says in January here, because that's what the state has officially said. Unofficially, the solicitation is more likely to happen in February. They'll be giving $5 million to each of those 13 regions to support that planning. The program also includes $500 million to support implementation grants. And these are really projects that the plans identify that will help move the region toward their vision of economic resilience. The implementation grant solicitation is expected to be released in June. Again, this is their current timeline. We expect that may change, although they are eager to get a first round of kind of early action, shovel-worthy projects approved, shovel-worthy meaning projects that people are already kind of invested in, that they see as being beneficial to their community, that there's been some vetting process for already. The funds need to be committed by June 2024 and really need to be spent down by June 2026. So again, there's some time to do this, but we're just heading into a season where we're going to be launching these planning processes that really need to engage community. If we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about that. So the regional collaboratives, what the trailer bill language says is that they need to include balanced representation of community, labor, government, and private sector players. It encourages a much broader table that includes folks from education, from health, from philanthropy, from the workforce development systems, and the like. There will be one collaboration selected per region. And it is still to be seen what parameters are put on those regions. The state has said that they will be releasing guidelines this week, maybe into next week. They're not sure. They're going to have a draft guideline process. The public comment period for that, they'll be holding open for about 40 days. So we'll have till late January to look at those guidelines and to offer feedback. We are really encouraging our partners to sit with those guidelines, to think about what's going to make the program work for you. What do you need to engage? What do you need to support yourself to engage, and to give that feedback to the state? We found them to be incredibly eager to hear people's feedback. They want to make this a process that actually is inclusive and that can be a model of what it looks like to do planning right. Organizations that can apply to be kind of the fiscal sponsors to help hold these regional planning processes include nonprofit organizations, district organizations of the EDA designated economic development districts, institutions of higher education or consortiums of those institutions, and then Indian tribes or consortiums of tribes. right now, that's who they're thinking could kind of hold that, receive that $5 million and then hold those planning processes. Next slide. So why and how is PolicyLink involved? We didn't help create this program, but we see that it really brings together many of the things that we care about as we think about equitable economy, healthy communities of opportunity, and really creating a just set of systems that include our communities in the decisions that impact their lives. So we're partnering with our colleagues at California Forward. California Forward leads a statewide movement to bring people together across communities, regions, and interests to improve government and create inclusive, sustainable growth for everyone. They really helped work on building this program and getting it passed by the legislature. Together, we are bringing our capacities and assets to try and ensure a more equitable, resilient, inclusive regional economic development by enabling connectivity, partnership, and accountability between the state, regional planning entities, and communities. Next slide. Our collaboration is really seeking to support both program design in its early phase. So we are providing a lot of recommendations to the state of California about what we think they should be doing to set up this program to center equity in it from the start. But the collaboration is also thinking about how we provide information, guidance, technical support, and advice to our partners in regions to support their development of inclusive, equitable, cross-sectoral, and multi-jurisdictional collaboratives. This is going to be hard work. Getting these collaboratives right is going to be challenging, and we know that many similar processes in the past have not felt inclusive for our community partners, and we really want to try and pivot to a new way of doing things. So we're eager to support folks and building the relationships and kind of knitting together the partnerships that are going to allow for planning to happen differently. We are relatedly trying to be a bridge builder and coordinating different regional efforts. So doing lots of listening to people and trying to connect them where we see alignment, where we see potentials for collaboration, where people need it. We are here to provide advice on preparation and implementation of SURF applications. We cannot write them for groups at this point. We don't have that level of capacity, but certainly available to be a sounding board, a thought partner, bring ideas and the like. We are doing a lot of work with data, thinking about what are data-driven frameworks that can be used to elevate equity in these processes. So thinking both about what is data the state can be using or bringing to regional collaboratives to make sure that we're actually thinking about how we deliver on equity goals in the processes and ensuring accountability to that. There's actually a request for information right now. The state is looking for an evaluator. They're also looking for feedback on what they should be evaluating. So it's a great opportunity for us to share with them what indicators we think the state should be measuring as they think about success and progress in this program. That RFI was issued by OPR and will be open until January 20th. Finally, the kind of last two areas that we're trying to provide support on are working with partners who are interested in serving as regional intermediaries to help them think about how they design their community engagement process so that it actually works and that community partners have voice and power in these processes and aren't just asked to show up to conversations where they speak and the information they provide kind of falls to the side. We want to help folks set tables that actually put community organizations in leadership roles where they're helping to design the process, where they're helping to make decisions along the way, and where they can leave really feeling ownership out of the product that comes from those planning efforts. Finally, we're talking to our funder partners and thinking about how we actually raise money for the community partners who are going to need resources and need to be resourced to participate in this work. We know that, and this is really true for all of the infrastructure investments, right? That these things happen often without us knowing they're coming. We haven't built in the FTE to actually do the work to shape implementation, but that's critical for us to be able to engage. So we're being very intentional about encouraging our partners. The endowment have been fabulous thought partners in this respect, but really thinking about how we bring that support, that financial support, into our community organizations so they can participate. I'll close out by just putting my slide up for contact information and some resources. Do please feel free to reach out to me. It's my first name at policylink.org. The final comment I want to share, if you go to the last link on this resources page, we have posted information about a series of regional listening sessions. We will be kicking off on Friday. We do not have the dates for the January sessions posted yet. We will be posting them very soon, but we will be doing a series of sessions in 10 regions around the state to provide more information on the program, to hear early thinking from regional partners around how they want to organize themselves for this work, and to help people make connections so that they're ready to move forward. I'll be happy to take questions as we move into the Q&A section. And I think we're going back to Marisol now.
Thank you so much, Shioni, Corey, Veronica, Michael, and Michael, for the very rich information and everything that you have shared with us, all the resources. So let's bring everyone back. I know we only have a few minutes left, but we do have a couple of questions from the audience that we would like to get to. And then we also have a survey that we would love for just a quick 2-question survey that we would love to get your feedback on. So let's jump right in with the first question. So the question is, will local jurisdictions have to apply, or are they just getting a formula allocation, or is it both? And then can we get a dashboard of funding pools to make sure jurisdictions partner with communities? So Michael, Tora, do you want to kick off with this one?
Sure. So while I was looking at that question, I actually drew a chart. I don't know if people can see it. Basically, but I'll explain it. Basically, it's both. There's actually 3 different ways, right? You're going to have money that's going to go through the feds to the state automatically, and then the state administers it out to communities. You're going to have funds that go directly, in certain programs, directly from the federal government to communities. It varies from program to program. For example, in a lot of transportation programs, it goes directly from the feds to what are called the metropolitan planning organizations, which are basically like associations of local government, right? And then, so that's money that's kind of going out. For some of these, it's like the federal government says, hey, we have this money available for you, but you're going to need to like match the funding, right? To draw down the money and actually spend it. So sometimes that match is 10%. Sometimes it's a local match of 20%. Again, it varies from type of project to type of project. There are some programs where there is no match. It's just all money coming out from the feds. And then on the other side, you've got the competitive grants. So the community is going to have to compete for those. And I think in terms of the dashboard question, I'll actually turn it back to you, Marisol. And I know that question came before Corey's presentation. Corey may have answered some of that in the course of his presentation. So,
yeah. So you'll see that the links have a lot of resources. And while they're not necessarily dashboards, we do have one document that I'm happy to share with everyone. Veronica has created like a tracker of some of the state level funding opportunities, and she updates that frequently. So we'll make sure that that's included in the resources. So let's see, the next question, and I think Shioni, if you could maybe jump in on this one. How can we find out about collaborative efforts in our area? And then maybe also couple it with the last question that we have here regarding if you're working with Partnership with California Forward, and are you doing your own listening sessions?
Wonderful. Thank you, Marisol. So we really encourage you to talk to your partners in your region around collaboration, and we're here to be a resource. So we are starting to kind of generate with California Forward lists of folks who have said they want to engage, who are interested in collaborating, and are trying to make connections where folks are eager to connect. I mentioned the building healthy communities because we see them as being critical community infrastructure that really you all have built over the last decade, that the building healthy community sites have brought people together to really envision what does our community need and to start aligning around work to do that. We think that SURF is only going to be successful if people are building on the work that they have already done. So we in our aspiration, folks like you all can be bringing those ideas, bringing the learnings from that process, bringing the best practices into these new regional collaboratives so that you're able to start with that rather than recreate it along the way. And I know the foundation staff can help you connect to the BHC partners in your region if you don't know who those folks are and if you have not already been connected to those. So I'm going to volunteer our TCE partners to support that, because that work really has brought together exceptional leaders in so many regions of California. And then I saw a note from Susan asking about the listening session happening on Friday. The listening sessions I mentioned are part of the Policy Link California Forward Collaborative. So if you participate in tomorrow's session, I will be speaking there too. I look forward to seeing you and other Redwood Coast partners at that session. Policy Link, as part of the collaborative effort, is also doing some one-on-one interviewing of folks just to hear what are folks worried about in these programs, what do they need to engage and the like. So some of you may be hearing from us in that way too.
Thank you, Shioni. And you will have Shioni's contact information through the slide deck. So to the question on how to connect with Policy Link, you'll have Shioni's contact information there. Okay, so, and then to the question about the video, yes, the video will be recorded and will be shared with everyone that was registered, along with the slide decks and all the resources that we're talking about. And then, Veronica, I think you had another resource you wanted to share.
Yeah, so I know there's a question about connecting with those in the region who may be forming a collaborative for SURF. And there's a group called the California Stewardship Network, and that is a group of regional organizations that are part of California Forward. And so I know many of those folks are interested in forming a collaboration. For example, if you're in Sacramento, Valley Vision is looking to do one. So that may be a resource for people if you want to reach out to some of those people in your region to talk about a regional collaborative. Again, it's the California Stewardship Network, and there's a list of folks on the California Forward website.
Great. Thank you so much, Veronica, for that. Okay, well, thank you so much for the questions that you all have put in the chat. I think we've gotten through everything, and I know we're at noon, but we do want to ask you now a couple of questions, and it'll be quick, I promise. So if we can bring up the questions. Next slide, Charlie, please. If you wouldn't mind, with your phone, scanning this QR code, or you can also go to the website, www.menti.com, and you enter the code that's on the screen. We would like to know from you, what policy topics would you be most interested in learning about in future webinars or events? The QR code is really easy because you do it through your phone and it takes you directly. And so if you could do that, that'd be great. I know a couple of our speakers have to hop off, and that's okay. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you have any trouble with Menti, please go ahead and enter your responses in the chat. and you will see some multiple choice responses that you can select. If the item that you want to put in is not there, the next option, the next question will allow you to put in others. So let's go ahead and go to the next, not the next slide, but the next screen on Menti. If you can go to that. Okay, and then question 2. What are the needs for community partners to be able to access funding? So what would be helpful from some of the things that you heard either from Corey or others? What are the needs for you all to be able to access some of this funding? And if you could scan the QR code and enter your responses, we would greatly appreciate it. And this is the last one. We're going to give everyone a minute to fill it out. Okay, and then the next screen on Menti will allow you to put in anything else that is not listed in the multiple choice questions. And we're going to give you just a quick minute. And then while you're doing that, just thank you so much again for joining us. We look forward to having you all join us back in 2022. We will have new webinars with new topics, and really looking forward to getting your feedback to inform what it is that you all are interested in. So thank you again for joining. Thank you, Raven Team, Crew Strategies, Policy Link, and Resources Legacy Fund for your participation today. And thank you all for watching. This concludes the program. Thank you and happy holidays.